My mailbox just got fined. Not me, my mailbox, and not for being rusty or broken, but because it failed to uphold community dignity. Yeah, that's an actual quote. Welcome to Willowbrook, where the HOA president thinks she's the Queen of England and we're all her poorly landscaped peasants. You think I'm joking? She once measured my fence color with a paint scanner. Things went from absurd to nuclear faster than you can say community standards. And it all started with a fine addressed to someone who's not even alive. Ever had a neighbor go full villain? Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from? Because this neighborhood needs witnesses. Let me paint you the picture. I'm Ethan Caldwell, 35 years old, and I work as a freelance IT consultant. I live in Willowbrook Estates, one of those fancy suburban neighborhoods where everyone's supposed to live in perfect harmony. My parents left me the house after a tragic accident, and I've tried to preserve everything, every rose bush, every laugh. This house isn't just drywall and shingles. It's the last place I still hear their laughter echoing through the walls. Every morning when I drink my coffee on the back porch, I could almost hear my dad's laugh echoing from the garage where he used to tinker with his old Chevy. That's when Karen Whitaker entered my life like a tornado in a trailer park. 3 months in, this woman showed up with a clipboard, a serial killer's smile, and the confidence of someone who thinks they invented lawns. She called herself HOA president and rattled off a list of infractions like a malfunctioning parking meter. According to her expert opinion, my grass was 2 inches too tall, my mailbox was the wrong shade of black, and my garden gnomes were inappropriate decorative elements for a prestigious community. I thought she was joking at first, but the woman was dead serious. The fines started small at first, $25 here, $50 there. I wasn't being fined. I was being slowly bled dry by paper cuts in Times New Roman. Every violation came with a condescending note about maintaining community standards and preserving property values. I paid the first few fines just to keep the peace, but something about this woman's attitude really rubbed me the wrong way. She handed me a 12-page handbook of community regulations that looked like it was written by someone with serious control issues. Then came the letter that broke the camel's back. Last Tuesday morning, I walked out to grab my mail and found this official-looking envelope from the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. I opened it up, expecting another petty violation, but instead, I found something that made my blood boil. The fine was addressed to Robert and Linda Caldwell, my parents, who died 2 years ago in a car crash. $500 for failure to maintain lawn to community standards, due within 14 days, or they would begin the process of placing a lien on the property. The letter hit like a gut punch. I stood frozen, staring at my parents' names on a fine. She was fining ghosts. I half expected the next violation to be for excessive haunting. The audacity was beyond anything I could have imagined. At the bottom, in Karen's neat handwriting, she had added a personal note. The deceased status of the property owners does not exempt this residence from community obligation. I immediately called the number listed on the letterhead, and of course, it went straight to Karen's personal cell phone. When she answered with her fake sweet voice saying, "Willowbrook HOA, Karen speaking," I could barely contain my rage. I told her exactly what I thought about her sending fines to people who've been dead for 2 years. Her response? "Well, Ethan, maybe if you took better care of the property, we wouldn't have this problem. Your parents' house is bringing down the whole neighborhood's reputation." That's when I realized this wasn't about community standards or property values. This was personal. This wasn't community management. It was a one-woman vendetta, and I had unknowingly become her favorite target. Over the next few days, she ramped up her campaign against me. She posted in our neighborhood group chat about certain residents who think they're above the rules and how some people need to learn respect for community standards. The passive-aggressive posts were clearly about me, and I could feel my neighbors starting to look at me differently. Turns out Karen had only just dipped her toes into crazy. The main event still to come. 3 days later, another letter arrived, this time for $1,000. The violation: my fence was painted forest green instead of community-approved hunter green. I kid you not, this woman measured the difference in paint colors with some kind of official color chart. When I called her to complain, she actually laughed and said, "Maybe you should consider moving somewhere more suitable for your lifestyle, Ethan." That's when I knew I was dealing with more than just an overzealous HOA president. I was dealing with someone who had serious power issues and was using her position to bully people she didn't like. I started asking around the neighborhood and discovered that Karen had a reputation for targeting people she considered undesirable. The elderly couple next door told me she had fined them repeatedly for having their grandchildren's bikes in their driveway. I realized I needed help, and that's when I remembered Sarah Bennett. Sarah lived 4 houses down and worked as a paralegal at a downtown law firm. Her father had lived in the neighborhood for 20 years before Karen took over as HOA president, and according to Sarah, Karen had made his final years absolutely miserable with constant fines and harassment. When I knocked on Sarah's door and explained my situation, her eyes lit up with a familiar fire. "Karen's gone too far this time," she said, inviting me in for coffee. "Fining dead people? That's got to be illegal somehow." Sarah offered to help me research the HOA regulations and see if Karen was overstepping her authority. As we sat in her kitchen, going through the community charter and state regulations, Sarah suddenly stopped reading and looked up at me with a huge grin. "Ethan," she said, "I think Karen just made a massive mistake." She showed me a section about debt collection practices and regulations regarding deceased individuals. Apparently, there are very specific rules about how to handle financial obligations when someone dies, and Karen had violated every single one of them. I felt a surge of hope for the first time in weeks. Maybe I wasn't crazy. Maybe Karen really was overstepping her bounds, and maybe, just maybe, I could fight back. Sarah leaned back in her chair and said something that gave me chills. "Karen thinks she runs this neighborhood like her personal kingdom, but she just messed with the wrong family. And trust me, she has no idea what's coming for her." As I walked home that evening, I felt something I hadn't felt since my parents died: determination. Karen had picked the wrong guy to mess with, and she was about to learn that some fights aren't worth starting. Remember that secret Sarah found about Karen's illegal fines? Well, it turns out that charging dead people money is a massive violation of federal debt collection laws. But when I confronted Karen about it, that's when things got really ugly. And I mean really ugly. I sent her a carefully worded email explaining that fining deceased individuals violates the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act and demanded she immediately withdraw all fines sent to my parents' names. I was polite but firm, thinking maybe she just didn't know the law. Boy, was I wrong about that. Karen's response came within 30 minutes, and it was nothing like I expected. Instead of acknowledging her mistake or apologizing, she doubled down harder than a gambler in Vegas. Her email was basically a legal word salad claiming that HOA regulations supersede federal guidelines and that my parents' estate was still responsible for all community obligations. She actually wrote, "Perhaps if you spent less time making excuses and more time maintaining your property, we wouldn't have these issues, Ethan." But here's where it gets really crazy. 2 days later, I woke up to find my front garden completely destroyed. Apparently, Karen had hired some landscaping company to accidentally trim the wrong property. They claimed it was a mix-up with addresses, but the crew supervisor let it slip that someone had specifically told them to clean up the overgrown mess at the Caldwell place. My mom's prize-winning rose bushes, the ones she'd spent 15 years nurturing, were cut down to stumps. The ornamental shrubs my dad had carefully arranged around the walkway were completely gone. I stood there looking at the destruction, and I swear I could feel my parents' hearts breaking all over again. When I called Karen to complain, she put on this innocent act that would have made a Hollywood actress jealous. "Oh my goodness, Ethan, what a terrible mistake. But you know, maybe this is a blessing in disguise. Your landscaping was looking a bit outdated anyway. Now you can start fresh with something more appropriate for our community standards." The fake sympathy in her voice made my skin crawl, but I knew she was behind it. This wasn't an accident. This was psychological warfare. That's when Karen really started playing dirty. She began spreading rumors through our neighborhood group chat about how I wasn't paying my HOA fees and was apparently $3,000 behind on community obligations. Complete lies, but some of my neighbors started believing her. Mrs. Patterson from next door, who used to bring me homemade cookies, suddenly stopped making eye contact when she saw me outside. The Johnsons across the street, who always waved from their front porch, started closing their curtains when I walked by. Karen was systematically turning my neighbors against me, and it was working. But I wasn't going to take this lying down. Sarah had given me some advice about documenting everything, so I started recording my phone conversations with Karen. The third time I called her about the bogus fines, she finally dropped her mask and showed her true colors. "Listen here, Ethan," she said, her voice getting cold and sharp. "I don't like you, and I don't want you in this neighborhood. Your parents were fine people, but you're nothing like them. You're disrespectful, you don't follow rules, and frankly, you're bringing down our property values. I'll do whatever it takes to make you leave, so you might as well start looking for somewhere else to live." I couldn't believe she had actually said that out loud, but thank God I had it all on recording. When I played it for Sarah, her jaw dropped. "She just confessed to harassment and abuse of power," Sarah said, shaking her head in disbelief. "This woman is digging her own grave." But Sarah also warned me that Karen wouldn't go down without a fight, and she was absolutely right about that. The next week, I got a visit from Tom Reynolds, one of the other HOA board members. Tom was a decent guy who ran a small auto repair shop and had always seemed pretty level-headed, but when he showed up at my door, he looked nervous and kept glancing around like he was afraid someone was watching. "Ethan," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something about Karen, but you didn't hear it from me, okay?" He explained that Karen had been threatening to fine him for having work vehicles parked at his house overnight, even though he'd been doing it for years without any problems. The only reason she was backing off was because Tom had agreed to support her in any HOA disputes. But here's the really crazy part. Tom told me that Karen had been falsifying some of the HOA meeting minutes to make it look like the board had voted on regulations that were never actually discussed. She would add items to the agenda after meetings and then claim they had been approved unanimously. "She's been doing this for months," Tom whispered, "and I've been too scared to say anything because she threatened to fine me into bankruptcy. But what she's doing to you, it's just wrong, man." That evening, Karen called an emergency HOA meeting to discuss what she termed ongoing community disruptions caused by non-compliant residents. She didn't mention my name specifically, but everyone knew exactly who she was talking about. The meeting was held in the community center, and I could feel the tension the moment I walked in. Karen sat at the head of the table like she was chairing a corporate board meeting, with her fake smile and her stack of official-looking documents. She started the meeting by discussing the importance of maintaining community standards and how certain individuals were trying to undermine the authority of the HOA. Then she dropped the bomb. She claimed I owed over $2,000 in fines and late fees, and if I didn't pay within 7 days, she would begin the process of placing a lien on my property. The room went dead silent, and I could feel every pair of eyes staring at me. Some of my neighbors looked shocked, others looked disappointed, and a few looked downright angry. But that's when Tom surprised everyone, including me. He stood up from his seat and cleared his throat. "Karen," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "I think we need to discuss whether some of these fines are actually legitimate. I've been reviewing our meeting minutes, and I don't remember voting on several of these regulations." The room erupted in murmurs, and Karen's face went white as a sheet. She tried to maintain control, saying that Tom was confused about the meeting details, but you could see the panic starting to creep into her eyes. After the meeting, several neighbors approached me privately to apologize for giving me the cold shoulder. Apparently, some of them had started to suspect that Karen's stories didn't add up, especially after Tom's comments about the meeting minutes. Mrs. Patterson even admitted that she had never actually seen any evidence of me not paying my HOA fees, and she felt bad for believing Karen's rumors. As I drove home that night, I felt like maybe, just maybe, the tide was starting to turn. Karen's mask was slipping, and people were beginning to see her for what she really was, a power-hungry bully who would say or do anything to get her way. But I also knew that cornered animals are the most dangerous, and Karen was definitely feeling cornered. Sarah's words kept echoing in my head. She has no idea what's coming for her. Little did I know how right she was, and how much crazier things were about to get. Time to drop the bomb. I had been planning this moment for days, and Karen had no idea what was about to hit her. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening, and I came prepared with my secret weapon, that recording of Karen admitting she wanted to force me out of the neighborhood. Sarah had helped me prepare my presentation, and we both knew this was my one shot to turn the tables on Karen's little dictatorship. The community center was packed that night, more crowded than I'd ever seen it for an HOA meeting. Word had spread about the drama from the previous meeting, and apparently half the neighborhood wanted to see what would happen next. Karen walked in wearing her usual fake smile and her power suit, carrying her oversized binder of regulations like it was some kind of holy scripture. She looked confident, maybe even a little smug, probably thinking she had me right where she wanted me. The meeting started normally enough, with Karen going through the usual agenda items about community maintenance and upcoming events. But when she got to unfinished business, she looked directly at me and announced that this would be my final opportunity to resolve my outstanding financial obligations before the HOA began legal proceedings. She even had the nerve to suggest that I could avoid further complications by simply selling my house and moving somewhere more suitable for my lifestyle. That's when I stood up and asked for permission to address the board. Karen looked annoyed but couldn't refuse without looking petty in front of everyone. I walked to the front of the room, pulled out my phone, and announced that I had something everyone needed to hear. "This is a recording of a conversation I had with our HOA president 3 days ago," I said, and then I played Karen's voice for the entire room. "I don't like you, and I don't want you in this neighborhood. I'll do whatever it takes to make you leave." The reaction was immediate and explosive. People started whispering and turning to look at Karen, whose face had gone from confident to horrified in about 2 seconds. She jumped up from her seat and started shouting that the recording was fake, that I had somehow manipulated her words, and that everyone was being deceived by my desperate attempts to avoid responsibility. But the damage was done. Everyone had heard her cold, vindictive tone, and they could tell it was genuine. But Karen wasn't going to go down without a fight. She pulled out her own folder and announced that she had consulted with a lawyer who confirmed that my recording was inadmissible as evidence and possibly illegal, since I hadn't informed her I was recording the conversation. She also claimed that I was guilty of harassment and defamation, and that the HOA would be taking legal action against me for damaging the reputation of community leadership. The room erupted into chaos, with people arguing and taking sides. Some neighbors were clearly shocked by what they had heard and started demanding explanations from Karen. Others seemed confused and didn't know what to believe. A few of Karen's supporters started claiming that I was just a troublemaker, trying to avoid paying legitimate fines. The whole situation was spiraling out of control, and I could feel my advantage slipping away. That's when Sarah stepped in to save the day. She had been sitting quietly in the back of the room taking notes and watching everything unfold. When Karen started making threats about legal action, Sarah stood up and identified herself as a paralegal with experience in HOA law. She calmly explained that recording conversations is perfectly legal in our state, as long as one party consents, which I obviously did. Then Sarah hit her with the legal equivalent of a frying pan, explaining how Karen's threats bordered on criminal intimidation. But Sarah wasn't finished. She had been doing her own research into the HOA's financial records, and she had found some very interesting discrepancies. Apparently, several of the fines that Karen had issued over the past 6 months weren't properly documented in the official HOA records. There were receipts for expenses that didn't match the approved budget, and some of the emergency repairs that Karen had authorized seemed suspiciously overpriced. Karen tried to dismiss Sarah's concerns, claiming that as a mere paralegal she didn't understand the complexities of HOA management. But several board members started asking questions about the financial discrepancies, and Karen's answers were becoming more and more evasive. Tom Reynolds finally stood up and announced that he thought the board needed to conduct a full financial audit before proceeding with any legal action against anyone. The meeting ended without any clear resolution, but something had definitely shifted in the room's dynamics. People were no longer automatically taking Karen's side, and several neighbors approached me afterward to express their support. Mrs. Patterson apologized again for believing Karen's rumors and admitted that she had never actually seen any evidence of the violations Karen claimed I had committed. But I could see that Karen was furious, and I knew she wouldn't let this go. As people were filing out of the community center, she cornered me near the parking lot and hissed, "You think you're so smart, Ethan, but you have no idea who you're messing with. I've been running this neighborhood for 5 years, and I'm not about to let some nobody computer nerd destroy everything I've built." Her mask had completely slipped at that point, and I could see the real Karen underneath. Angry, vindictive, and absolutely convinced that she was entitled to control everyone around her. But I also noticed something else in her eyes that gave me hope. Fear. For the first time since this whole mess started, Karen looked genuinely worried about the consequences of her actions. As I drove home that night, I felt like I had won the first real battle in this war. The recording had damaged Karen's credibility, and Sarah's financial questions had planted seeds of doubt about Karen's management. But I also knew that this was far from over. Karen had too much invested in her position to give up easily, and I had a feeling that her next move would be even more desperate and dangerous than anything she had tried before. Sarah called me later that evening with some interesting news. She had been digging deeper into the HOA's public records and had found evidence that Karen might have been falsifying more than just meeting minutes. There were irregularities in the financial reports that suggested someone had been manipulating the books, and if Sarah's suspicions were correct, Karen might be in serious legal trouble. "She's panicking," Sarah told me, "and people who panic make mistakes. Big mistakes." Guys, things just got real, and I mean really real. Karen had just pulled the dirtiest trick in her playbook, and I'm not even sure I saw it coming. 3 days after our explosive HOA meeting, I woke up to the sound of someone pounding on my front door at 7 in the morning. When I stumbled downstairs in my pajamas and opened the door, I found 2 police officers standing on my porch with very serious expressions on their faces. "Are you Ethan Caldwell?" the taller officer asked, checking his notepad. When I confirmed my identity, he continued, "We received a report about suspicious activity and potential security threats in this neighborhood. The complaint specifically mentioned this address." I was completely confused and asked what kind of suspicious activity they were talking about. The officer explained that someone had called in reports of threatening behavior, potential property damage, and disturbing the peace. They needed to ask me some questions and possibly search the premises. My heart was racing because I had absolutely no idea what they were talking about. I invited the officers inside and tried to explain that there must be some kind of mistake. That's when the shorter officer mentioned that the complaint had come from a concerned community leader who wished to remain anonymous for safety reasons. I immediately knew exactly who had made that call, but I couldn't prove it. The officers were professional and polite, but they still spent 45 minutes going through my house and asking questions about my interactions with neighbors. They wanted to know if I had any disputes with anyone in the community, whether I had made any threats, and if I had any history of aggressive behavior. I answered honestly and even showed them the recordings and documents from my HOA dispute, but I could tell they thought I was just another suburban drama case. After the police left, I was sitting in my kitchen trying to process what had just happened when my phone rang. It was Mrs. Patterson from next door, and she sounded upset. "Ethan," she said, "I think I owe you an explanation. Yesterday afternoon, a woman came to my door asking questions about you. She said she was conducting a safety survey for the Neighborhood Watch program, but some of her questions seemed really personal and invasive. Mrs. Patterson described how the surveyor had asked about my daily routines, whether I seemed angry or unstable, and if I had ever made any threatening comments. The woman had also mentioned that there were concerns about potential violence and that neighbors should be extra vigilant. It didn't take a genius to figure out that Karen had been going door to door, spreading lies and trying to build a case against me. But the really sick part was what happened next. Around noon, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a nervous-sounding man identified himself as Mike Henderson, a contractor who did occasional work in our neighborhood. "Listen," he said, "I think you should know that someone paid me to make a complaint about you to the police. A woman named Karen offered me $500 to call in a report about threatening behavior and property damage." Mike explained that Karen had approached him at a coffee shop and offered him cash to make false accusations against me. She had provided him with specific details about what to say, and even gave him my address and description. But Mike had gotten cold feet after talking to his wife about it, and he decided to come clean rather than take Karen's money. "I don't know what kind of beef this lady has with you," he said, "but she's playing some serious hardball." My jaw hit the floor. Karen wasn't just drunk on power, she was now forging the receipts for the hangover. This wasn't just HOA politics anymore, this was serious criminal behavior. I immediately called Sarah and told her what had happened. Her response was immediate and furious. "That crazy woman just crossed a line that she can't uncross. Filing false police reports is a felony and witness tampering is even worse." But Karen wasn't done with her dirty tricks. That afternoon, I received yet another fine in the mail, this time for $5,000. The violation? Construction of unauthorized structures without proper permits. According to the notice, I had built a shed or workshop on my property without HOA approval. The problem was, there was no shed or workshop. Karen was literally fining me for buildings that didn't exist. When I called to dispute the fine, Karen's assistant, who I later learned was actually Karen using a fake voice, told me that the violation had been confirmed by a professional inspection and that photos were available upon request. When I demanded to see these photos, they sent me pictures of my neighbor's garden shed taken from an angle that made it look like it might be on my property. The level of deception was mind-blowing. That evening, I was feeling overwhelmed and honestly considering whether Karen might actually succeed in driving me out of the neighborhood. The stress was getting to me, and I was starting to doubt whether fighting back was worth all this drama. I was sitting on my back porch, looking at my mom's ruined rose garden, when Sarah knocked on my door with some papers in her hand and a huge grin on her face. "Ethan," she said, practically vibrating with excitement, "I found it. I found the smoking gun that's going to destroy Karen once and for all." She spread out copies of financial documents on my kitchen table and started explaining what she had discovered. Apparently, Karen had been embezzling money from the HOA's maintenance fund to pay for personal expenses. There were receipts for a spa weekend, expensive dinners, and even a down payment on a new car, all paid for with community funds. Sarah had also discovered that Karen had been creating fake invoices for maintenance work that was never actually performed. She would submit bills for tree trimming, pressure washing, and landscaping services, collect the money from the HOA account, and then pocket the cash. The total amount was over $15,000, which definitely qualified as grand theft. But the most damning evidence was a series of emails between Karen and a real estate development company called Sunset Properties. They had been discussing the potential sale of the community's common areas, including our small playground and the green space where families had barbecues and kids played soccer. Karen had been negotiating a deal that would net her a substantial commission while destroying the things that made our neighborhood special. I just couldn't believe what I was seeing. This woman wasn't just a power-hungry bully, she was a full-blown criminal who had been systematically stealing from her own neighbors. Sarah explained that she had already made copies of everything and was planning to submit the evidence to both the police and the district attorney's office. Tomorrow night's emergency HOA meeting is going to be very interesting, Sarah said with a wicked smile. Karen thinks she's going to use it to rally support for getting rid of you, but instead, she's going to get the surprise of her life. As Sarah gathered up the documents and prepared to leave, she turned back to me with a serious expression. Karen's about to learn that when you mess with good people, eventually the truth catches up with you. I spent the rest of that evening feeling a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Finally, we had real evidence of Karen's corruption, and finally there might be some justice. But I also knew that cornered criminals can be dangerous, and Karen had already proven she was willing to go to extreme lengths to protect herself. Tomorrow's meeting was going to be explosive, and I had no idea how Karen would react when her whole world came crashing down. I had the evidence that could destroy Karen's little empire, but I had no idea she was about to go completely nuclear. Sarah and I had spent the entire day preparing our presentation for the emergency HOA meeting, carefully organizing all the financial documents and emails that proved Karen's theft and corruption. We thought we had her cornered, but Karen was apparently planning one final, desperate attack that would either destroy me completely or backfire spectacularly. The meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m., but around 4 o'clock that afternoon, I heard cars pulling into my driveway. When I looked out the window, I saw 2 official-looking vehicles and several people in suits walking toward my front door. My heart sank because I thought Karen had somehow managed to get me arrested, but it turned out to be investigators from the district attorney's office responding to Sarah's evidence submission. The lead investigator, Detective Martinez, explained that they had received Sarah's documentation about the HOA financial irregularities and needed to ask me some questions about Karen's management practices. I spent 2 hours going through everything I knew about Karen's behavior, from the fraudulent fines to the attempted bribery of Mike Henderson. Detective Martinez seemed very interested in the timeline of events and took detailed notes about each incident. But while I was talking to the investigators, Karen was apparently staging her own preemptive strike. Around 6 p.m., my phone started blowing up with messages from neighbors asking if I was okay and whether the rumors about me being investigated for financial crimes were true. Apparently, Karen had been calling people all afternoon, telling them that I was under investigation for embezzling HOA funds, and that tonight's meeting would address my criminal behavior. The irony was unbelievable. Karen was accusing me of exactly what she had been doing, but her strategy was working because several neighbors were sending me worried messages, asking if I needed help with legal representation. Some people were even suggesting that maybe I should skip the meeting to avoid further embarrassment. Karen was trying to flip the script and make herself look like the victim of my supposed crimes. When I arrived at the community center that evening, the parking lot was completely full, and there were people standing outside because the meeting room couldn't accommodate everyone. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife, and I could see people whispering and pointing when I walked past. Karen was already at the front of the room, looking like she was preparing for the performance of her life. She started the meeting by announcing that tonight would address serious allegations of financial misconduct that threatened the integrity of our community. She claimed that a thorough investigation had revealed evidence of embezzlement and fraud, and that the guilty party would be held accountable. The way she was talking, you would have thought she was some kind of crusading hero instead of the actual criminal. But then Sarah stood up and asked for permission to present evidence to the board. Karen tried to refuse, claiming that Sarah wasn't an official board member and had no standing to present anything. but Tom Reynolds surprised everyone by supporting Sarah's request, saying that if there were serious allegations being made, all evidence should be examined transparently. That's when Sarah dropped the bomb. She walked to the front of the room with her stack of documents and calmly announced that she had evidence of the real financial crimes that had been committed against our community. She started by showing the fake invoices for maintenance work that was never performed, then moved on to the receipts for Karen's personal expenses, paid with HOA funds. The room went dead silent as Sarah methodically presented each piece of evidence. You could have heard a pin drop when she read Karen's emails about selling our common areas to Sunset Properties. People's faces went from confusion to shock to absolute outrage as they realized what Karen had been doing with their money. Karen's response was pure desperation. Karen unraveled faster than cheap wallpaper in a hurricane, shrieking about forged papers and conspiracies with all the grace of a cornered raccoon. She claimed that I had somehow hacked into her email account and created fake financial records to make her look guilty. The more she talked, the more unhinged she sounded, and the more convinced everyone became that Sarah was telling the truth. But Karen had one more card to play, and it was uglier than anything she had tried before. She suddenly stood up and announced that she had additional evidence of my criminal behavior that she hadn't wanted to reveal publicly. She spun a tale about me threatening the board. Said Tom was too scared to speak up. He looked ready to pass out from the lie. Tom looked absolutely shocked and immediately stood up to deny Karen's accusations. "That's completely false," he said loudly. "Ethan has never threatened me or anyone else. Karen, you're lying." But Karen kept talking over him, claiming that Tom was now being intimidated into changing his story, and that everyone could see how I was controlling the narrative. The room erupted into chaos, with people shouting questions and demanding answers. Some of Karen's remaining supporters were trying to defend her, while others were calling for her immediate resignation. I could see that Karen was desperately trying to create enough confusion and doubt to escape accountability for her crimes. That's when Detective Martinez walked into the room. Apparently, he had been monitoring the situation and decided that Karen's public accusations constituted witness tampering and obstruction of justice. The entire room fell silent as he approached the front table and addressed Karen directly. "Miss Whitaker," he said in a calm but authoritative voice, "I need you to come with me for questioning regarding the financial irregularities in the HOA accounts. You have the right to remain silent, and you have the right to an attorney." The look on Karen's face was priceless. Pure shock, mixed with the dawning realization that her lies had finally caught up with her. As Detective Martinez escorted Karen out of the community center, the room exploded into conversation. People were asking questions, expressing outrage about the stolen money, and demanding to know how this could have happened. Tom Reynolds took control of the meeting and announced that the board would be conducting a complete audit of all HOA finances and implementing new oversight procedures. But even as Karen was being led away, I could see her looking back at me with pure hatred in her eyes. This woman had built her entire identity around controlling our neighborhood, and now it was all crashing down around her. I had a feeling that even though the authorities were involved, Karen still had some tricks up her sleeve. People who are used to getting their way don't usually give up easily, especially when they're facing serious criminal charges. As I walked home that night, I felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Finally, Karen's crimes had been exposed, and justice was being served. But I also knew that desperate people do desperate things, and Karen had already proven she was willing to go to extreme lengths to get revenge. The war might be won, but I had a feeling the final battle was still coming. Karen was officially in custody, but she wasn't going down without trying to take me with her. The next morning brought news that would shake our entire community to its core and expose just how deep Karen's corruption really went. I woke up to find Detective Martinez on my doorstep again, but this time he had documents that revealed the true scope of Karen's criminal enterprise. "Mr. Caldwell," Detective Martinez said as he sat down in my living room, "we've been digging deeper into Ms. Whitaker's financial records, and what we found is much worse than simple embezzlement. She was planning to sell your community's public land to developers, and the profits would have gone directly into her personal accounts." He showed me emails and contracts that proved Karen had been negotiating with Sunset Properties to purchase the playground, the community garden, and the small park where neighborhood families held barbecues and kids played soccer. The deal was worth over $200,000, and Karen would have received a 20% commission as the community representative. But here's the really sick part. She had forged signatures from other board members to make it look like the sale had been approved by the entire HOA. Tom Reynolds, whose signature appeared on several documents, had never seen these papers before and certainly never agreed to sell community property. What made this even more outrageous was that these common areas weren't just random pieces of land, they were the heart of our neighborhood. The playground had been built with funds raised by families over several years, with parents volunteering their time and labor to create a safe space for their children. The community garden produced fresh vegetables that residents shared with elderly neighbors who couldn't maintain their own gardens. Those weren't empty plots of grass. They were stitched with birthday memories, backyard dreams, and the stubborn roots of real community. Detective Martinez explained that Karen's plan had been to push through the land sale while everyone was distracted by her campaign against me. She had already received a substantial down payment from Sunset Properties, which explains some of the mysterious deposits in her personal accounts. If her scheme had succeeded, families would have woken up one morning to find bulldozers destroying their children's playground and replacing it with condominiums. But the investigation revealed something even more disturbing about Karen's psychology. In her personal emails to the development company, she had written things like, "These people don't deserve these amenities," and "The community needs better oversight of its resources." She genuinely believed that she had the right to sell property that belonged to everyone because she considered herself superior to her neighbors. The community meeting that evening was unlike anything I had ever experienced. When Tom Reynolds announced the details of Karen's land sale scheme, the room erupted in outrage that made our previous meetings look like polite tea parties. Parents were furious about the attempted theft of their children's playground, gardeners were devastated about losing their shared growing space, and everyone was shocked by the sheer audacity of Karen's plan. Mrs. Patterson stood up with tears in her eyes and talked about how her grandchildren had taken their first steps on that playground and how she had been looking forward to watching future grandchildren play there too. The young couple from Maple Street described how the community garden had helped them through financial difficulties by providing fresh food when money was tight. Person after person stood up to talk about what these spaces meant to them and their families. But Karen wasn't finished causing damage, even from her jail cell. That afternoon, she had apparently called several neighbors from the county detention facility, trying to convince them that I was the real mastermind behind some elaborate conspiracy to frame her. She told people that I had hacked into her email accounts, created fake financial records, and manipulated evidence to make her look guilty. Some of Karen's most loyal supporters were actually starting to believe her conspiracy theories. A small group of residents, led by the Hendersons from Oak Avenue, began circulating a petition demanding that the charges against Karen be dropped and that I be investigated for fraud and harassment. They claimed that Karen was being railroaded by a vindictive neighbor who couldn't handle legitimate HOA enforcement. The division in our community was heartbreaking. Neighbors who had been friends for years were now arguing about who to believe and what really happened. Some people thought Karen was a victim of circumstances, while others were convinced she was a master manipulator who had fooled everyone for years. The stress was affecting everyone, and I could see that some families were even considering moving away to escape the drama. That's when Tom Reynolds really stepped up and showed the kind of leadership our community needed. He organized a special meeting where Detective Martinez would present the evidence publicly and answer questions from residents. Tom wanted everyone to see the actual documents and hear the facts directly from law enforcement rather than relying on rumors and speculation. The presentation was devastating for Karen's remaining supporters. Detective Martinez showed bank records proving that Karen had deposited the Sunset Properties down payment into her personal account. He displayed email chains where Karen discussed how to handle community opposition to the land sale. Most damning of all, he played a recorded phone conversation where Karen told the development company that the residents will complain, but they'll get over it once they see the property value increases. Even the Hendersons, who had been leading Karen's defense, fell silent when they heard her voice, dismissing their concerns about losing community spaces. You could see the moment when Karen's spell finally broke, and people realized they had been defending someone who viewed them with complete contempt. But the biggest shock came when Detective Martinez revealed that Karen had been planning to use the profits from the land sale to fund her exit strategy from the neighborhood. She had been looking at expensive condominiums in an upscale part of the city and planned to disappear with everyone's money once the deal was finalized. She had never intended to stay and face the consequences of her action. As the meeting ended and people filed out, I could see that our community was beginning to heal. The truth had finally come out and people could start processing what had really happened. Karen's remaining supporters were apologizing to their neighbors for doubting them, and everyone was talking about how to rebuild trust and move forward together. Tom approached me as I was leaving and said something that really stuck with me. You know, Ethan, Karen thought she could divide us and conquer us, but all she really did was help us figure out what kind of community we want to be. And it's definitely not the kind of place where one person gets to decide what's best for everyone else. As I walked home that night, I realized that Karen's downfall was complete. But I also knew that the real work of rebuilding our neighborhood was just beginning. The question now was whether we could create something better from the ashes of Karen's toxic leadership, and whether the lessons we had learned would prevent another wannabe dictator from taking over our community. Karen's empire had crumbled, but the final chapter of this nightmare was about to reveal just how deep her deception really went. 3 weeks after her arrest, Detective Martinez called me with news that would blow everyone's mind and finally close the book on Karen Whitaker's reign of terror. The investigation had uncovered evidence of voter fraud that went back to the very beginning of Karen's time as HOA president. "Ethan," Detective Martinez said when he arrived at my house with a thick folder of documents, "we found something that changes everything we thought we knew about how Karen became HOA president in the first place. She didn't just abuse her power, she stole it." He spread out voter registration records and election documents that revealed Karen had created multiple fake resident identities to vote for herself in HOA elections. The scheme was incredibly sophisticated. Karen had registered fictitious residents at vacant properties and rental units throughout the neighborhood, then cast ballots for these phantom voters in every HOA election for the past 4 years. She had created detailed backstories for her fake residents, complete with forwarding addresses and emergency contact information. Some of these fictional people had even been listed as volunteers for community events they never attended. Detective Martinez showed me registration cards for people like Margaret Thompson, who supposedly lived in the rental duplex on Elm Street, Robert Kim from the apartment complex on the edge of our neighborhood, and Patricia Williams, who was allegedly renting a room from an elderly resident who had no idea her address was being used for voter fraud. Karen had voted for herself dozens of times under these fake identities, which meant she had never legitimately won any election. This revelation was absolutely staggering because it meant that every decision Karen had made as HOA president was legally invalid. All the fines she had issued, all the regulations she had implemented, and all the contracts she had signed were null and void because she had never had the legal authority to make those decisions. Our entire community had been living under the rule of someone who had literally stolen her position through systematic election fraud. But the investigation revealed something even more twisted about Karen's psychology. In her personal notes, which detectives found during their search of her apartment, she had written detailed assessments of her neighbors that read like psychological profiles. She had categorized residents as compliant, potential threats, or targets for removal, and had developed specific strategies for dealing with each group. My family's file was particularly disturbing. Karen had written that my parents were acceptable residents who follow rules and don't cause problems, but that I was arrogant and non-compliant with potential for community disruption. Turns out, Karen had been eyeing my family like some HOA Bond villain, scheming long before tragedy even cracked our front door. The community meeting where Detective Martinez revealed this information was surreal. People sat in stunned silence as he explained how Karen had manipulated our democratic process for years. Mrs. Patterson kept shaking her head and saying, "I can't believe it. I just can't believe it." The young family from Maple Street looked like they were in shock, and even Tom Reynolds seemed overwhelmed by the scope of Karen's deception. But Detective Martinez wasn't finished. The investigation had also revealed that Karen had been using her position to retaliate against neighbors who had opposed her in the past. The elderly man who lived alone on Pine Street had been targeted with excessive fines after he questioned one of Karen's spending decisions. The family with teenagers on Oak Avenue had been cited repeatedly for minor violations after they complained about Karen's treatment of their kids. Karen had kept detailed records of her revenge campaigns, complete with timelines and strategy notes. She had written things like, "Increase pressure until they comply," or "relocate," and "find violations to justify financial penalties." It was like reading the diary of a neighborhood dictator who viewed her residents as subjects to be controlled rather than neighbors to be served. The legal consequences for Karen were severe. She was facing charges for embezzlement, fraud, election tampering, filing false police reports, and a dozen other crimes. Her lawyer was trying to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutor was pushing for significant jail time given the scope and duration of her criminal behavior. More importantly for our community, the district attorney's office ruled that all of Karen's actions as HOA president were legally invalid. Every fine she had issued was voided, every regulation she had implemented was rescinded, and every contract she had signed was nullified. People who had paid thousands of dollars in fines over the years were getting full refunds, and families who had been forced to make expensive property modifications could reverse those changes. The community decided to hold a special celebration to mark our liberation from Karen's tyranny. We organized a neighborhood barbecue in the very park that Karen had tried to sell to developers, and it turned into the biggest community gathering anyone could remember. People brought food to share, kids played on the playground that Karen had tried to destroy, and everyone seemed genuinely happy to be together. During the barbecue, Tom Reynolds made a speech about the importance of transparency and accountability in community leadership. The neighborhood voted to implement new oversight procedures to prevent anyone from accumulating too much power, and we established regular audits of HOA finances to ensure that what happened with Karen could never happen again. But the most meaningful moment for me came when Mrs. Patterson approached me with a small potted rose bush. "This is from my garden," she said with tears in her eyes, "but it's the same variety your mother grew. I thought maybe you could plant it where hers used to be, and we could all help you bring her garden back to life." Over the next few weeks, neighbors brought plants and volunteered their time to help restore my mom's garden, and it became even more beautiful than it had been before Karen destroyed it. As for Karen herself, she was sentenced to 3 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA and individual residents. The judge specifically mentioned that her abuse of a position of trust and her targeting of vulnerable community members warranted a significant sentence. Karen's final statement to the court was a rambling speech about how she had been trying to protect property values and how ungrateful residents had conspired against her. 6 months later, I was working in my restored garden when I received a letter that made me laugh out loud. It was from the Maplewood Heights HOA, a community about 20 miles away, asking for my advice about dealing with their own problem board member who was exhibiting concerning behavior. Apparently, word had spread about our experience with Karen, and other neighborhoods were reaching out for guidance on handling similar situations. I wrote back with detailed advice about documentation, legal resources, and community organizing strategies. It felt good to know that our horrible experience might help other people protect themselves from wannabe neighborhood dictators. Karen had tried to make my life miserable, but in the end, her downfall became a cautionary tale that would help other communities recognize and stop similar abuse before it went too far. As I finished writing this response letter, I walked out to my back porch and looked at my mom's thriving rose garden. The flowers were blooming beautifully, the community was stronger than ever, and justice had finally been served. Sometimes the biggest bullies are just scared people with a little bit of power, but when good people stand together and refuse to be intimidated, the truth always wins in the end. And Karen Whitaker? Well, she's learning about real community standards in a place where the rules actually matter and everyone has to follow them equally.